Infrastructure. It's one of those things which is certainly not sexy. I mean, certainly not talked about enough, but it's necessary. It defines a lot of what you can do as a navy. It defines a lot of what you can do as an army or an air force. You know, one of those comments which throwaway lines which comes up about when talking about World War II is there's nothing more difficult to move than a heavy bomber squadron because of the amount of support it requires, because of the logistics that goes into it, the sheer amount of bombs it will drop, the sheer amount of bombs you need to be delivering to it. All these things have an effect on where you can base these things. In current and more recent times, a lot of the issues in Afghanistan were down to the logistical supply. The fact that you either had to fly things in or bring it mostly by road, extremely unreliable road. Railways, they're good for heavy logistics. Major highways, they're good for heavy logistics. If you've ever seen most modern nations these days, most developed nations, or whatever we want to call them, the rich ones, they tend to have a whole slew of different capacities for moving goods around them. They tend to have railway lines for moving heavy duty freight. They have ports. They sometimes have canals, which are still in use. And they have lots of roads. Lots and lots of roads with lots and lots of lorries going up and down them all day, every day. And that is the point, really. You need this logistics, this infrastructure to be able to move, to be able to operate as an economy. But all those lorries, those trains, they need some places to go to be repaired. And honestly, when you think about it, that's the big problems if you're talking in the UK about using road trains, especially the size you have in Australia, etc. Not just the roads themselves and the fact that they aren't designed for that level of transportation, but there's also where is there big enough spaces for you to take them off the road and maintain them? This is a simple but a ultimately fundamental problem. You need to be able to maintain what you have. When we're talking about the Royal Navy, though, this gets a lot more complicated the further you go back and the further you come forward, because it's not that complicated in the Age of Sail, because if necessary, you can pull a ship up and careen it. It's not really good and not something you want to do with a first rate, or definitely not, or a second rate, but, you know, if you have to, you'll give it a go for a third rate. You'd prefer to do it with a fourth or fifth rate, but you can do certain maintenance yourself, crew wise. Once you get into modern ships, and I'm not even talking about the dreadnoughts, I'm talking pre-dreadnoughts, even further back into the ironclad era, you start to need far more advanced docking. That's the reason the Royal Navy sets up the dock it does in Bermuda when it does. And that's part 4. There's a reason the Royal Navy builds the dockyards it does, but there's a problem with building dockyards. Once you've built them, they stay the same size, while ships grow. The classic example, of course, is battle cruisers. When they enter service with the Invincibles, they're roughly 20,000 tons. a little over a decade later, here comes HMS Hood, 47,000 tons. Oh, and the G3s are being planned, and they're even bigger. Suddenly, your locks, which could have accommodated, and sadly enough for the RN, there weren't a lot of locks that could accommodate them, the Invincibles, etc., become far fewer that can accommodate HMS Hood. And this is where the Royal Navy operates, worldwide. The Royal Navy has bases in all these places. And all these ports are important because they have graving docks. But not all graving docks are created equal. And I know this is a 1909 list again I am showing you, but it is a perfect example of what you're dealing with, because if you look at it, this is 1909. And, well, let's see. Green-wise, it's not as universal as he'd like it to be. It's not as universal as anyone would like it to be from a logistical and infrastructure point of view. Greens are the easy to put in. You've got some in Devonport. You've got a couple in Portsmouth. You've got some in Gibraltar. But even they have trouble with the indefatigable class of battle cruisers. Bermuda, not going to happen. Hong Kong, nope, not even Invincible really is going in there nicely, because it's got to have the Cassian put into the outer stock. And most of these are home water ones. If the government's going to strap up any money to upgrade a graving dock, you'd expect it to be the ones at home, them to be prepared to maybe build out into the rivers and into the estuaries they feed off, or purchase the land to make them deeper in terms of length and depth. Because a graving dock is not just a function of its length and its depth and its width. A graving dock is also a function of how much water and displacement it can manage. Yes. Limitations sometimes exist, which are not just in the abstract details, but in the cumulative impact. Mostly, you're able to deal with it based on the abstracts, because usually the abstracts work out fine. However, sometimes you're in an area which can't deal with a lot of pressure, or a lot of back pressure of water. And what was a fine graving dock when you originally constructed it, now can't take you bringing in ships which are at its maximum theoretical size and capacity. Because whilst the ships used to be the same size, the ships are also getting denser. They're getting heavier, they're displacing more. And yes, there's a factor of draft and all those sort of things in it. But it becomes an issue. For example, there are ships which, if we go back to this scenario, they can only go into the docks if they're lightened. I.e., there are docks they can fit in, but only if they've been lightened. Canopus can go into 5 and 6 at Chatham if it's been lightened. So can the Duke of Edinburgh, can go into Dock 5 at Chatham if it's been lightened. Bellerophon, Dreadnought can go into the floating dock of Bermuda if they have been lightened. They have to be in completely lightened conditions, because whilst they theoretically can fit in, it's going to cause an issue. lightened, makes them ride artificially higher when they come into the dry dock. Or the graving dock, as this is. Because there are two forms of dry dock, a floating dock and a graving dock. The Royal Navy wants to deploy all the way around the world. They want to go all these places because they need to protect the British Empire. And yet, do they have the necessary dockyards around the world? Well, that becomes a limiting factor in terms of your construction. You have to work out whether you construct ships which are powerful enough they can meet your potential opponents as equals, or can fit in the docks that you can support them, or are you going to have to upgrade the docks? Now, before the Washington Naval Treaty and the various other treaties, which, by the way, didn't just limit ship design, they also limited what you could do to shipyards and infrastructure places for ports, especially around the world. Domestically, you had more of a say, but, on your foreign bases, the Empire bases, well, things were more of an issue. Because of that, this becomes a limiting factor. And something the Royal Navy consistently has to balance. One of the criteria that often comes up when people start discussing the G3 and N3 and these super ships which the Royal Navy is planning post World War One is that they're designed for, to an extent, to exploit as much as they can of existing infrastructure. And some people suggest that this is the hard limit on the Royal Navy. And it's not really. But the thing is, they reckon they need newer ships before they're going to have time to improve the existing infrastructure. And those ships are going to have to be in service and operating while they're improving the existing infrastructure. So this is that generation plan. The generation that would have come after them, well, they would probably have been bigger. They would probably have been better in some way. And they would most likely have been able to make use of bigger facilities. One of the real problems for the Royal Navy was the timeline of World War One, and then the followed up by the Washington Treaties meant the next generation of expansions of dry docks, not just in the UK but worldwide, didn't really happen. The Royal Navy managed to get a few dry docks upgraded in the late 1930s. But honestly, the dry docks we are still using to this day, the dry docks we depend on for the Queen Elizabeth class, aircraft carriers, all these things that limit their size, are mostly the dry docks as are defined by the pre-World War One expansion building program, which was built up to deal with what was considered that generation plus 15 years. The plan was that there would have been another building up program plus 15 years. When you consider HMS Incomparable, the planned super ship which Jackie Fisher wanted, again, one of the refrains that come against it says, there's not enough dry dock facilities for it. The Royal Navy had been contacting and discussing with Cammell Lairds, with other dockyards for more than 2 years, from pretty much 1912 onwards, about extending and expanding their graving dock facilities. The Royal Navy didn't want a scenario where they were dependent upon one dry dock. because that doesn't make sense. Being dependent upon one dry dock basically gives your opponent a single point of failure. Again, this is a problem the Royal Navy is currently facing on the Queen Elizabeth class, because de facto we're dependent upon the Rosyth dry dock. Portsmouth one hasn't been built. New one for them. That was planned. Has been planned. Money's been assigned for it at various points. Nothing's happened. The other facilities around the world, facilities around Britain and around the world, they're lovely, but they're all commercial ones and in use, and they have varying levels of security and support, as have been discussed in the previous video about this. So that is something the Royal Navy has to face. And that is a scenario the Royal Navy never wants to face. Anyway, let's get into the first of these foreign dockyards, Hong Kong Naval Yard. Originally set up during the First Opium War, when the Royal Navy arrived to protect the opium traders. You always have to remember the first war on drugs was fought by the British to promote drug selling. Can I have a laugh or cry at these things? A gentleman called Sir Edward Belcher, who was aboard HMS Sulphur, landed in Hong Kong on the 25th of January, 1841. There was actually a street named Possession Street that was named to mark the event, but its Chinese name apparently translates mouth of the ditch street, so you know. It was Commodore Sir Gordon Bremer who would raise the Union Jack on the 26th of January 1841, and naval store sheds were erected by April 1841. So basically the Royal Navy turned up and started building stuff. They had a storekeeper and agent victualler, Thomas McKnight, appointed by March 1842. And then construction was carried out at various sites, including another site between 1845 and 1855. In fact, eventually the Royal Navy demolished West Point store sheds and surrendered land to the colonial government in 1854 in exchange for the plot of land where now the Admiralty Station of the Mass Transit Railway stands. They continued building up yards and building up supplies and support, and eventually they established HMS Tamar, which was the Royal Navy sort of base ashore. At the sort of in 1902, so this is part of this round, they started establishing a full naval dockyard, and this was done by land reclamation. They took up 36,000 square meters of floating basin to repair and refit vessels afloat, and also 183 meter graving dock, and there was 160,000 square meters of land reclamation and a 36,000 square meter floating basin. So it's entirely artificial. And this would stand the Royal Navy instead through the entirety of World War One, the interwar years, and into World War Two. Of course, they lost it quickly, but it's a pretty cool facility they establish, and it's there to support them. What people often forget is that the basin is as important as the graving dock in many respects. Having a safe space to bring in your ships, to be able to store them, to be able to deal with their basic needs. If they don't need to go in a graving dock, but they need to have repairs, etc., having such a safe space to bring your ships in can make a big difference to your ship's operations. How do I put this politely? let's say the magnet on my phone case starts to go. It's a magnet latch. Let's say it starts to go, or let's say this bit holding it, this piece of leather starts to go. Now I can ignore it when it's a little bit and just keep ignoring it. And eventually it'll break completely, and then it'll require major work to fix it, or I'll have to buy a new one. Or if when it's a little bit, just let's say a little bit of a cut, I can do some stitching. Or maybe I can apply some more leather to strengthen it and stitch that in. I can do a patch quickly, efficiently, easily, and not have to replace the whole thing. It's the same with a basin. If I've got a safe space, I can bring a ship in to do a easy piece of maintenance, a relatively easy and small one. I can therefore delay needing major maintenance. So I can make the graving dock use far more efficient by reducing demand. Preventative maintenance is a key factor in readiness of navies. Then we have Bombay. Now, Bombay is another early starting point. It's arguably started in as roughly 1613, or it could be even earlier than that, by the East India Company, as they created their own navy in 1613 officially, and it called it the East India Marine. They built up a shipyard at Bombay, with equipment being sent there directly from the UK. And beginning in 1670, Bombay began to be developed as a shipyard, and by 1686, Bombay had become the headquarters of not only the English East India Company and its fleet in India, which was renamed to the Bombay Marine, but also pretty much the Royal Navy's operations in India were also based out of the same yards. A refit yard was built, a supporting shore organisation consisting of a marine storekeeper, at that time Mr. William Minchin, who was appointed in 1670, and a master shipbuilder, Mr. Warwick Pett, were both set up in their posts. And they basically copied the Royal Navy dockyards as they existed in the 17th century, and the administration of them, and pretty much said, right then, this is how we're going to run our dockyard. They also used local experienced people, including shipwrights from another base at Surat, who were used to constructing vessels using Malabar teak. One of their number, a gentleman called Luigi Nuswarje Wadia, and several generations of descendants, a key figure in the success of the yard. There's actually a whole section on it in one of the chapters in the New Cambridge History of India. In 1742, a post of Superintendent of the Bombay Marine was created, along with a Commodore, Bombay Marine, and 7 other commanders. The Superintendent controlled the dockyard, and the Commodore reported to him. A purser of the Marine, being in charge of the accounts, a master builder and storekeeper in charge of departments. Additionally, in 1742, a Bombay Marine Board was established to administer the dockyard, consisting of the superintendent, the commodore, and 2 senior captains as the facility's customers, and the superintendent's deputy, the master attendant. In the 19th century, the Department of the Admiralty gradually took over responsibility of the yard, and day-to-day administration of the yard passed from the superintendent to the Navy Board, Resident Commissioner Bombay, who actually continued to work with the Wadia family as the master shipwrights of the yard. Duncan Dock was built at this time, which was at that time the largest dry dock outside of Europe, and was constructed in 1807 between 1807 and 1810, and remains in use to this day. It was an amazingly important and amazingly useful centre of construction. And it was something which Britain depended upon right up till the end of World War II. We have ships going to Bombay to being refitted, being dry docked, and not small ships, big ships. Okay, they can't take a hood, but they can take a lot of other pretty large vessels for the Royal Navy. This matters. But again, you have to start consider once you're considering empire logistics, and we have to start thinking about this. You have to consider the huge concentration of yards they have in the UK versus the distances between the yards they have around the world. Bombay is a long way away from Hong Kong. Even Singapore. There is a lot of water between the two of them. You need a lot of bases to support fleets being able to operate worldwide. You need that kind of infrastructure. Malta. Oh, one of those traditional dockyards. It's just been in use for so long, and it's just so useful. Malta seems to always be whatever major navy which doesn't have its own bases in Mediterranean is the major naval power in the Mediterranean. Seems to make a lot of use of Malta. The Royal Navy and Britain basically camped out there. And at several points, there was Her Majesty's Dockyard at Malta established. To this day, the US Navy likes to go to Malta for their refits. And Malta is, arguably, in some ways, a dockyard, just writ large, especially around Grand Harbour and that area. These were some of the biggest and most important docks the Royal Navy had access to in the world. They were some of the facilities at Malta were what the facilities which were able to actually accommodate things like Hood. The floating dock at Hood. Malta is one of the big pictures I have of Hood actually being in a dry dock. Which seems to be a rare occurrence because there aren't that many dry docks which can actually take Hood. And I know I keep using Hood as this sort of example, but this is the point. The Royal Navy's largest, most prestigious ship, there weren't a lot of yards, there weren't a lot of facilities that could actually support it, which puts a limit on the operations you can do with it. They do. Then we have Halifax Naval Base, starting off as Her Majesty's Canadian Dockyard, HMC Dockyard Halifax. It was acquired by the Canadian government from the Royal Navy following the withdrawal of British naval forces and military forces from Canada in 1906. Prior to 1906, it was known as the Royal Navy Dockyard, Halifax. Now, the Royal Navy Dockyard, Halifax is an interesting facility. It was initially defended by its own large blockhouse, 3 redoubts, and a fortified stone wall. That tells you how important it was. These defences were enhanced later and replaced by a large network of army fortifications, the main purpose of which was to safeguard the naval dockyard, including nearby Fort Needham, Fort George, the Halifax Citadel, the York Redoubt, Fort Charlotte on Jerusalem, Fort Clarence in Dartmouth, and the 5 forts on McNabbs Island, and the extensive batteries at Point Pleasant. That shows you how important this area was. Many of the original Royal Navy and 18th and 19th century dockyard buildings were destroyed in the 1917 Halifax explosion. So that's one of the problems we have in assessing their true impact and worth to this today, is that we are going by paintings and plans and pictures. A lot of them were actually destroyed, though, which does rather put a issue on the archaeology. Only one residence from 1814 and the Admiralty's residence from 1816 survive. The Admiral's residence is now the Maritime Command Museum, and the original Navy dockyard clock has been restored and moved to Halifax Ferry Terminal entrance. You can still go see it. You can go and see a lot of things to do with the dockyard. And it's rather a cool place, but again, what is this facility for? It's a facility which is established in 1749 for the purposes of, well, first establishment nearby is established in 1749. It's established for the Royal Navy to operate on the North America and West Indies Station, or rather North America Station. It's establishing a base from which their fleets can operate if they need to. And the reason why protecting the naval yard is so important is because as long as the Navy can still run to Canada, Britain can resupply Canada from the rest of the empire. So any American, later French when it began, but later on American invasion of Canada would ultimately always have to take Halifax. There are disputes on how quickly and how effectively they could, because you're not getting to Halifax quickly. And it's got a lot of fortifications around it to protect it, which, yes, you can win a fight in, but can you win a fight quickly enough? Prior to World War I, prior to the treaty system, you have to win it quickly enough. You have to win it quickly enough that the overwhelming might of the Royal Navy will not turn up before you have won. Because if the overwhelming might of the Royal Navy arrives before you have managed to get through those forts, whatever naval forces you have involved in it are not going to be there for much longer. The US Navy will fight bravely, honorably. They will give a good account for themselves. They will cost the Royal Navy ships. But thanks largely not to any lacking in martial ardor or anything, it's thanks to Congress and the way they are quite so happy to keep cutting funds from the US Navy. The USN don't have a lot of ships actually available and afloat to do any of these plans. This is one of the things when I look at some of the War Plan Red, which is the plan for War Britain and invasion of Canada, especially some of the earlier versions of it, you sit there and go, it's lovely on paper, but in reality, you first have to mobilize these ships, and it's not like post-World War II and going into the Korean War when you have the whole reserve and all these mothballed ships and they're all brilliantly mothballed and all those things. It's nowhere near that. It's going to take far longer to get these ships up and running and far longer to find crews. And the trouble is, on paper, you're equal. But in actual numbers deployed, in actual force generation, initially the Royal Navy's ahead. Now, a longer term conflict, we all know the American infrastructure industry can be built up. They have huge areas to do it. But it wouldn't exactly be easy, because you can't exactly do an island hopping campaign to get to the UK. You pretty much have to invade Ireland. or France. And for Britain, it would have to invade. Well, it would have to probably recapture much of Canada. It's not a good. It's one of the interesting things. War Plan Red and the various other British war plans, which people sometimes look at and go, this shows they were thinking about war with each other. No, they were working out what was their worst scenario. And honestly, the worst case scenario for either side was fighting the other, because they knew each other's strengths. They knew exactly what they were dealing with. And they were each the most powerful navies in the world. If you want to train your mind, you don't think about fighting weaklings. Cockatoo Island. Oh. Well, this is a major facility, and they actually build light cruisers there. HMS Adelaide in 1918 was launched in at Cockatoo Island Dockyard. They fit out various destroyers, various other things during World War II, and that sort of building stuff. It is a really important facility, and it cannot be overstated how much it matters. Mainly because the whole bay around Cockatoo Island acts as sort of a rather large basin. So you have all the facilities, all the stores on the island itself, but you don't need a basin. You have the dry docks, you have the Fitzroy Dock, and you have the Sutherland Dock. But you also have this huge space that you can use. And I also always find it interesting that there is another Birkenhead not that far away from it. It always seems rather appropriate to me that wherever there is a shipbuilding centre, somewhere in the legacy of the British Empire, Birkenheads seem to turn up. Think about it. Have a look at the map. There's a few of them. Simonstown. Well, Simonstown is a first established in 1743 by the Dutch East India Company. It was taken over by the Royal Navy in the 1790s. This is a critical facility. In World War One, in World War Two, it matters. And the graving dock is still in use. It's still critical to the operations of the South African Navy. And it's called the Selborne engraving dock, and for some reason or other, every time I try and remember its length, I can never remember it. It's 240 meters long and 29 meters wide when it was originally built. It's been modified a bit in time, but it's a sizable facility. It's a sizable facility. Almost long enough to take HMS Hood. All it will need is an extra 30 meters added. No, it's a little bit longer than it was originally built, but I don't think it's quite long enough to take Hood yet. But it's a sizable facility. There are a lot of ships which can make use of that dockyard. But we're now going back to the point that I started with, and that is The Royal Navy has a tremendous advantage in that it has all this infrastructure around the world to support its operations. But unless you expand that infrastructure to keep pace with modern construction, that infrastructure itself becomes a restrictor on you. Or you build ships which can exploit that existing infrastructure. For example, if you can't build, if your battleships and battlecruisers have grown larger and far too large to take advantage of it, but you still have lots of bases which can still take roughly 20,000-ton ships, then filling them with 10,000-ton ships is inefficient. This is where we come back to the other refrain I have on this channel to do with cruisers, and that the heavy cruiser, as it was defined based on the light cruiser the RN was building, the Hawkins class, which was going to have a 7.5-inch gun and all these sort of things because it was a light cruiser. So that sets off the limitations of the heavy cruiser. It's actually a light cruiser. And scout cruisers are what define the light cruiser in the treaty system. And we end up with clear blue water between them and the capital ships, when really the intermediary ship would have been incredibly useful to have. I can imagine there's a fair number of Royal Navy officers who were kicking themselves that they didn't go with the 18,000-ton 9.2-inch armed design they considered instead of building the Hawkins class, or as the Hawkins class, because that would have probably led to a slightly increased definition for capital ships under the treaty system. And B, could have allowed them to build true heavy cruisers. Esquimalt Naval Base is special. It's a dry dock which really does matter. The first graving dock built there was built in the sort of late 1860s, early 1870s. Because they'd had to be taken to Seattle, Washington to be done, i.e. in the USA. Dependence on American shipyards was not considered a good thing. And they started surveying in the late 1860s. They finally started construction in 1876. It takes a long time to get money and things through. It's commissioned in 1887, so only 21 years to build it, having cost nearly $1.2 million to build, which in 1887 is a lot of money. A lot of money. HMS Cormorant was the first vessel to use New Dock on 20th July 1877. And during its first 7 years, the graving dock apparently serviced 24 merchant ships and 17 navy ships. From 1887 to 1927, the graving dock averaged 21 vessels per year. So think about that. 21 vessels a year means on average, the ships need to spend 2.5 weeks in dry dock. From 1927, the Navy graving dock was put out of use until HMCS Koticook docked there in 31st August 1945. And even though it's now over a century old, the dock is still used to regularly service and repair RCN ships and is part of the fleet maintenance facility. It's still critical. It's still useful. But again, notice that there was a large gap in use. And that gap was mostly due to money, because it costs money to keep these things going. And yes, it's if they're a fully civilian operation, they keep it going by doing profitable things, and Navy has to fit in around them. If you're running it as a Navy-focused operation, which occasionally takes on civilian ones to try and get some extra money in, then it's probably going to cost you money. Because there are going to be times you're not going to turn down jobs because you know you've got a Navy ship coming in. And rather than squeeze them in because the Navy ship has got to take priority, you go no, and you have a gap. And finally, Devonport. Well, we have the wonderful Calliope Dock, which is part of the Devonport Naval Base, which is what is down in Auckland. And I love this whole facility. It's basically built, how do I put this politely? The Royal Navy turn up and build it in 1841. And if you're noticing that a lot of these yards are started in the 1840s, there is a reason for that. That's when ships start to need a lot more facilities to support them. And when the British Empire is really growing, but also the governments are prepared to invest in massive infrastructure projects in the colonies and in Britain because it's a good method of employment. Again, the often factor which comes back is there is a sort of misunderstanding of the traditional history of the British government and the British Empire and of the way it was run. And I would say it's more a reflection of post-World War II politics and its effect on history looking back, because it sort of hardened groups into their dividing lines and trying to say, well, one side and the other's the other side. But the traditional frame didn't matter whether it was a conservative government or a liberal government, in times of economic crisis was, okay, yes, laissez-faire, we do not touch the economy, we don't play around with these things, but we can start a massive infrastructure program and we can't start building warships. Because we always need warships and you always need infrastructure. And it's a good way of creating mass employment, which actually generates more employment. Because here's the thing, warships require lots of things throughout the economy. So they're a good way of keeping your heavy industry and your high-tech industry going. In fact, lots of different levels of industry going, with the companies tending to give the money to give them monies, especially once you appoint a primary contractor constructing it. They will then farm out parts of the work to other subcontractors, and it'll spread through the economy and give you money going through the economy. It's a formula which is sometimes used for trickle down economics, but it actually works quite well. Whereas the infrastructure, when you're building infrastructure, when you're building things like ports, railways, roads, canals, dockyards, graving docks, basins, all these things, it helps by preparing your facilities for the next generation of trade, by boosting trade, by making trade easier, by making movement easier, by making communication easier, which facilitates economic growth long term. It's not... One of the things I find so disturbing these days is whenever you start talking about public works projects like this, there is a certain section which will of the world which will automatically focus in on saying, oh, that's got to be socialist, or that's nationalist. It's not. It's sound economics. It's sound national strategy to invest in infrastructure, to make sure you have the roads, the docks, the facilities you need. In the 1840s, and 1860s, that was plainly understood. Why? Because there's no point having a navy to defend your empire if it can't go where it needs to go. And in order to support the navy, you need docks. So, duh. And at the moment, guess what? We're in a recession. So, guess what? Wages are depressed. Yeah, so it's going to be cheaper. But we're going to have to go take out loans to pay for it. So what? We're the government. We can print our own money if we do it within reason. And for some reason, when governments are investing in infrastructure, people tend to complain about and think about what this money could. These days, they complain and think about what that money could be spent on elsewhere. That could buy X number of textbooks for schools and this and that. And I agree, those are all worthy things which need to have money spent on them. But infrastructure is about the long term. A textbook is great. Textbooks are wonderful. I tend to have to buy textbooks for my teaching every couple of years because new versions come out. Dry docks, still in use 100 years later. Yes, they can't take battleships anymore. None of us have battleships, barring a few sitting in America, to actually go on them. But, that doesn't matter. They're still useful. They're still critical facilities. You need the textbooks. You also need the dry docks. You need the hospital beds. You also need the railways. And I know that's going off into the political realm, but that's the point I'm trying to make with this, is it's not just about building ships. It's about building the infrastructure behind the ships. We talk about the aircraft carrier program, and I really worry that the reason the Portsmouth dry dock wasn't built was because the government decided to use money from the carrier program to delay the construction of the carriers, to slow them down because they wanted to put off them entering into service to try and save money. So they paid for a slower construction. Where did that money come from? Well, it came from within the defence budget, and I'm presuming it came from the part of the budget which was probably assigned to building a new graving dock in Portsmouth. And that's not sensible. That's not smart. That's very extremely short-termist. And governments of all sorts of hues have made those same decisions over the years. If we consider if we look through most of the modern navies and the issues with them, Australia's current submarine program. The reason they have the submarine and they have the issues they have the submarine program is because they stopped building submarines and they didn't keep up a low rate of production. So they don't have their own facilities, so they're having to buy something in from abroad. Rather the same with frigates. Honestly, if you were being sensible, when the Leander project was finished, you needed to set up Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, and UK, British frigate design bureau, joint frigate design bureau, which would just keep working and producing frigate designs for them. So they constantly have a frigate available, a good frigate design available, and constantly have construction facilities and be able to share them across, because that's the way they could scale up the need to require the economies of scale to keep it viable. Sort of getting at the Type 26, but there's problems with the Type 26 in that mostly it was originally designed to fit the British requirement, and the others are coming afterwards. And the Canadians have been far more prepared to redesign things than the Australians. The Australians have been prepared to add stuff in, but they haven't wanted to modify things. And I think that's largely due to the infrastructure they have available. I think that's one of the things they're looking at. Their existing infrastructure and limitations that puts on their ships. Especially when you consider they have to share that infrastructure with their LHDs. So this is the point, ultimately, you're dealing with. You can have all the fanciest, swankiest pieces of tech you want. But if you haven't invested in the foundations to support your fleet, the infrastructure, you can't do a lot with it because everything needs maintenance. Everything needs maintenance. Fleets are incredibly versatile and useful tools, but they have a high baseline entry cost. You pay it, you have something incredibly useful. Like Amazon Prime. It's incredibly useful to have it, but you have to pay that cost up front. You have to be able to pay that cost up front. That's the first thing. You have to have the spare money you can afford to pay it. And then you actually have to pay it. You have it, it's useful. You don't have it, makes life more difficult in all sorts of little ways. Yes, you can theoretically pay a premium every time for things to be delivered more quickly and all the other stuff. That's perfectly all right, but makes life just that little bit more difficult. Right then. So tomorrow it's the Duke of Edinburgh class coming out, so I hope you'll enjoy that one. I'm going to be recording that next. So I hope you've had a good day, and I hope you're enjoying this series, and I hope that didn't get too ranty. I do apologise, but infrastructure is one of those things which, how do I put this politely, gets me impassioned. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed, and take care.